perspective, this was really a coveted piece of real estate. As you can see how fertile it is, it was really the breadbasket of the ancient Israel. And because it had such great soil, great climate, but it also had something else, and that is it was a major transportation artery. Anyone who would come in from the Mediterranean and go inland, it would be through this valley here, the Valley of Jezreel, sometimes called the Valley of Esdraelon. And if you went north to south, kingdoms from the north to kingdoms of the south, they had to pass through this valley, one of the major roads of the ancient world. And we're going to be at Megiddo a little bit later, ran by a pass in the Carmel Mountains called the Via Maris. It was, and so whoever controlled that site, and we'll talk about that later, really kind of controlled world commerce. But what I really like about this place is you can see so many biblical events, and if it was clear, it would be so much easier. But I'm just going to kind of describe a few that are really prominent. Can you see through the haze, that hump? You see where my finger's pointing? Okay. Through that haze, that is Mount Tabor. And when we think about Mount Tabor, we think about Judges chapter 4 and 5. You know, what happened at that time when the children of Israel had a really hard time taking the Valley of Jezreel because the Canaanites had advanced weaponry. They had chariots. And so they had a real tough time with it. Well, it was in Judges chapter 4 during the period of the judges, and Deborah was the judge at the time. She had Barak assembled 10,000 Israelites on that hill that you're looking at right across there, that Mount Tabor. Well, it was hard to keep the movement of 10,000 Israelite soldiers a secret, and they didn't want to keep it a secret anyway. And so the Canaanites then brought their army here, and they were here in the Valley of Jezreel, the Canaanite army, and Deborah and Barak and 10,000 Israelites are up on that hill that you're looking at over there. And so the Canaanites had over 900 chariots, and eventually the Israelites had to come down, and so they knew they would just absolutely wipe out the Israelites with a 900 chariot force. And of course God intervenes, and Barak and Deborah rush down the slopes of that hill over there. God creates this great storm that comes up. It turns this valley in front of us into just a bunch of mud. The Canaanite chariots can't go anywhere. And so it turns into an Israelite rout. Well, that happened right here, right in front of us, at the base of that hill over there. By the way, that's the story. The Canaanite commander jumps out of his chariot, and he's trying to get away on foot, and he comes to a lady who he thinks they have a good relationship, his tribe and their tribe, and she goes, here, come on, hide in here. And he goes in there, and he says, if anybody comes, tell them I'm not here. She goes, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And so he's so wiped out and so tired, and of course when he goes to sleep, she takes a tent peg and nails his head to the ground through his temple. So that all happens in here. So that's one of the main stories that happens right in front of where you're looking. Now, if it was really, really clear, and we could move over just a little bit, we'd come to the next hill, and that's called the Hill of Moreh. And a couple of significant things there in history, just chapter 5, chapter 6 of Judges, an Amalekite army's parked in here over by the Hill of Moreh, and Amalekites and Midianites, and just right down the valley, just a little bit down the valley to our right, if it was clearer, you could see Mount Gilboa and another Israelite army camp there. And there's a spring right over there on the other side of Mount Gilboa called the Herod Spring, and that's where God came to a man, Gideon. And it was here that God told Gideon, he had 32,000 men. He said, it's too many. You guys will think that you won this victory. And so he said, send everybody home that's afraid. So 22,000 of them left. 10,000 remained. He said, no, it's too many. And the drinking test then, who gets on their knees and then who takes the water up to their hands. And with 300 men then, it was here, again, just Mount Tabor kind of as the guide, since we really can't see the Hill of Moreh. but just to the right of that is then where that great victory. He takes the 300 men, divides them into three companies. You know, the torches and the trumpets, and so that route took place as well right here in the valley. Another important one, if we could see the Gilboa Mountains that kind of run up through there. In 1 Samuel chapter 28, Saul, the Philistines came up here. This valley was so important. If they controlled this, they really chopped off half of Saul's territory. The people in the north could not; they were cut off from his capital. And so the Philistines saw an opportunity. They came up here, and about where the Amalekites were, over here at the hill of Moreh, the Philistines came. Saul brings his army down, and he camps out about where Gideon and his army was. And Saul's trying to get in touch with God, and God's not answering him. And so what Saul does is he kind of sneaks away, and on the other side of the hill of Moreh, there's a little town called Endor. And it was there he tries necromancy, calling up the dead. And, he goes to, we call the medium of Endor, the witch of Endor. Well, that's just right over there through the haze as well, so all that happens. Well, of course, God tells him through that look, tomorrow you're gone. And so on the mountains of Gilboa over here to our right, the Philistines the next day launch their attack. The Israelites are overwhelmed. They keep moving up the hills, the sides of Gilboa. The Philistines surround him. And it's over there on Mount Gilboa that Saul and three of his sons, including David's best friend and Jonathan, David's best friend, and the prince. I forget the word that I'm looking for, actually. But anyway, they were killed. So Saul and his three sons are killed, and their bodies are going to be taken to a place called Beit She'an that's just down the valley. Another little place, I don't know if you can see it. See these buildings right down here, these large buildings. And if you go to your right, this building I'm kind of pointing at, it looks like kind of an office building. Over to the right of it, it looks kind of like a mound. It's between that subdivision and these buildings. Can you see that? That's a tale of Jokneam, and you'll read about that in Joshua chapter 12. That was a Canaanite city, and during the conquest, the Israelites were here, and they took that city, but apparently they weren't able to hold on to that city for very long, and they eventually lost that city. So lots and lots of biblical history going on over here. In the days of Elijah, of course, and we'll talk about him in just a second, but after Elijah, of course, was Elisha. And so this is a significant place in Elisha's terms. Right real close, just to the right of Mount Tabor, again, where another mountain is, the hill of Moreh, and again, we can see it on a clear day. At the base of it, on this side of it, was a village called Shunem. And there was a couple who lived there, and they didn't have any kids. And you might remember it's in 2 Kings chapter 4. Elisha the prophet, they really appreciated his ministry, so they built him a room on top of their house. And every time he passed by, he had a bed to stay in. They fed him, and so as gratitude, God told Elisha, "I'm going to give him a kid. I'm going to give him a son." And so Elijah said, "I'm going to come back here next year, and you're going to be holding the baby." And they just couldn't believe that. Sure enough, that happened. Well, of course, you may remember the story how the boy grew up and he got older, and he's out with his dad one day, and he dies. He has this terrible headache. I've got a terrible headache, and so he dies. And Elisha, somewhere where we're at, somewhere on this hill is Elisha. And so she takes her dead baby boy, or her dead son, and puts him in Elisha's bed. And she starts crossing this valley here. And so he's somewhere up here on this mountain when he can spot her as she's closing in, and he tells the servant, he says, I think that's the Shunammite woman. Go see what you want, make sure everything's okay. And so he went down, and she just wouldn't talk to him, and she came up here somewhere where we're at, and she just wraps her arms around Elisha, and she won't go anywhere without Elisha. And so Elisha takes off, and he crosses the valley here and goes back to her house. And of course, then it's the beautiful story. He goes up there to his bedroom, and he lays down on her dead son, face to face, hands to hands, and God brings him back to life, and he gives her boy back to her. So that happens. right in here as well. And of course, the main thing that we think about, and again, those are just some of the biblical events that happens around here, this area that we're looking at. But of course, the most prominent one that we think about is 1 Kings 18, of course, and that is Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Somewhere along this range here, that's where it took place. And of course, 850 prophets. Ahab, King Ahab, by the way, the mountains of Gilboa that you'll see over there at the base of them, you can kind of just follow them down here in the valley of Jezreel. The ancient city of Jezreel was there, and that's where Ahab had his winter palace. And his capital was in Samaria up in the mountains, but in the wintertime it's much nicer here, and so he would have his palace right over there. And so he's been chasing Elijah for 3 years. And it came to this moment, of course, when they came up here. And this was kind of like the home territory of the Baal worshippers, because Baal was about fertility, storms and everything. And so you can see why this was a big Baal shrine, because look at all this fertility, climate here, the soil here. The Canaanites really said this is all about Baal. And so that's when God said, I ain't going to rain for 3 years, until I say it's not going to rain. And so that all happened here, and he said, you bring all of to Israel. Now what he meant was all the representatives of the people of Israel, and gather them right up here. And so Elijah's standing basically here all alone, and he's face to face with this king who's been hunting him for 3 years. All the people who've been persuaded away from Yahweh to Canaanite paganism, to Baal worship, they all gather here for that incredible moment. Who really is the one true God? Who really is the giver of all things? And we know the story, and how God made this dramatic, poured out his power here, and after he demonstrates that he is the true God. Now, you see that little line of trees? You just don't see it at the edge here. It looks kind of like a creek, or how a creek might run. That is the brook Kishon, and that's where Elijah had the prophets of Baals taken. They were slaughtered down there at the brook Kishon. Let me give you one last thing as we look at this and get a perspective of so many Bible events that happened right here. So and as we think about them, I want you to think about all the power of God that's being unleashed right here, what we're looking at, with the story of Deborah and Barak, how God delivered them, right? Just a demonstration of power right here. Gideon, right here, this power of God demonstrated. Elijah, right here, this power of God. Elisha, the Shunammite widow, and the healing son, right here. All of this has taken place right where you're looking at. And but no doubt the greatest power of God is unleashed right where we can see. Can you see this range right in front of us? Can you see Mount Tabor through the haze? We'll just move over to the left of that other ridge. Can you kind of see that other ridge? That is the Nazareth Ridge, and that's Jesus' hometown. And so if we could see it clear, there'd be white houses all along that. And so this is the place also where that greatest unleashing of God's power took place. And that's Jesus' hometown. So there's no doubt, many times Jesus, no doubt, obviously crossed this valley. And there stood on the Nazareth Ridge and looked out over this valley. And he was very familiar with this valley. So God's demonstration of power is all over this. And the one thing it reminds me of is, again, as I stand here, every time I stand here at this place on top of Mount Carmel, when I think of all of the Bible history, and I see all of these places where God unleashes his power, it just reminds me again of whose side we're on. And there's all this victory that you see. I'm reminded of the defeat that we saw over there and just mentioned with Saul. Saul chooses to abandon God. God unleashes his power there in a negative way. And so it should cause us to really stop and think again, kind of like in Caesarea, about what's really, really important in life. Listen, we serve the God who wins. He showed no matter how overwhelming things are, whether it's the whole Gideon episode, whether it's the Deborah and Barak episode, whether it's the Elisha and the Shunammite widow episode, whether it's Elijah here standing alone, or whether it's across on the Nazareth Ridge and his son, God is going to win. And it doesn't always look like it. It looks like the world and Satan is winning. But God, in his time and in his way, will once again unleash his power, and he will win. And so this is a reminder of a place. Stay faithful. Don't be deceived like all people were during Elijah's day. Don't be deceived. Hang on to God. He is the only one. He is the all-powerful, and He will win. All right. Thanks a lot, guys, and I'm going to turn it back over